There's something about the ocean that draws our deepest fears and wildest imaginations to the surface. Perhaps it's the way ships can simply vanish into the vast blue, leaving only questions in their wake. Or maybe it's how the sea keeps its secrets so perfectly, offering just enough clues to torment us, but never enough to satisfy our need for answers. Tonight, we're setting sail toward one of history's most perfect puzzles, a mystery so complete it has haunted maritime lore for over 150 years. Picture the endless horizon, where sky meets sea in a line so perfect it seems drawn by an invisible hand. Here, beneath a canopy of countless stars, the Atlantic Ocean holds its breath. The waves roll in gentle, rhythmic whispers, carrying with them stories that span centuries. Some tales speak of triumph, of ships that conquered storms and delivered their precious cargo safely to distant shores. Others whisper of tragedy, of vessels claimed by nature's fury, their remains scattered across the ocean floor. But there is one story the sea tells differently. It speaks not of a ship lost to wind and wave, not of timber splintered against jagged rocks, but of something far more mysterious. A story of a vessel found perfectly intact, sailing through calm waters with not a soul aboard. Her sails catching the wind, her cargo secure, her captain's coffee still warm in his cup. Yet every living person had simply vanished without a trace. This is the story of the Mary Celeste, and it begins not with an ending, but with a question that has haunted maritime history for over 150 years. What could make an entire crew abandon a seaworthy ship in the middle of the ocean, leaving behind everything they owned, everyone they loved, and every clue to their fate? Tonight, as we drift through the gentle currents of this tale, we'll discover how a routine voyage became the sea's greatest mystery. We'll meet Captain Benjamin Briggs, a man of unwavering faith who set sail with his wife and infant daughter, never to be seen again. We'll explore theories that range from natural disasters to supernatural forces, from human error to something beyond our understanding. And we'll uncover why this particular ghost ship has captured imaginations for generations, spawning countless stories, investigations, and sleepless nights wondering what really happened aboard the Mary Celeste. But to understand this mystery, we must first step back to a time when the ocean was humanity's great highway, when wooden ships carried the world's commerce across vast and treacherous waters, and when sailors lived by wind and stars, guided only by their skill and the grace of Providence. Chapter 1. The Age of Sail. The year was 1872, and the world moved at the speed of wind and current. Great sailing ships, their masts reaching toward heaven like cathedral spires, carried the lifeblood of commerce across the Atlantic. From the bustling ports of New York and Boston, merchant vessels departed daily, their holds filled with American grain, timber, and manufactured goods destined for the markets of Europe. In return, they would bring back fine textiles, wines, and the countless luxuries that fed a growing nation's appetite for the wider world. Life at sea in those days required a particular kind of courage. The ocean was both friend and enemy, provider and destroyer. A skilled captain could read the sky like a book, interpreting the subtle changes in cloud formation and wind direction that might mean the difference between a profitable voyage and disaster. The crew, weathered men with hands like leather and eyes that had stared into countless storms, worked in harmony with forces beyond their control. These merchant routes were well-traveled highways of the sea. The path from New York to the Mediterranean ports like Genoa or Gibraltar was as familiar to experienced sailors as a country road to a farmer. Ships would follow the Gulf Stream northward, then curve eastward with the prevailing westerlies, a journey that typically took 4 to 6 weeks. depending on weather and wind. Yet danger lurked in every league of ocean. Storms could rise without warning, transforming calm seas into mountainous walls of water that could crush even the sturdiest vessel. Pirates, though less common than in earlier centuries, still prowled certain waters, particularly near the coast of Africa. Equipment could fail at the worst possible moment. A broken mast in a gale, a split sail in heavy weather, or a compass that led ships astray in fog so thick it seemed solid. Perhaps most insidious of all was the loneliness. Weeks at sea with only the same faces, the same conversations, the same endless horizon could drive men to madness. Ships were small worlds unto themselves, floating islands where personality conflicts could fester into violence, where the smallest disagreement might explode into mutiny when there was nowhere to escape, no authority to appeal to, except the captain's word. The vessels themselves were marvels of engineering and craftsmanship. Built from sturdy oak and pine, their hulls were designed to flex with the waves rather than fight them. A typical brigantine like the Mary Celeste carried 2 masts, the forward one square-rigged with multiple horizontal sails, the aft mast rigged fore and aft with triangular sails that could catch wind from almost any direction. This configuration made them fast and maneuverable, perfect for the merchant trade where time was money and flexibility meant survival. The rigging was a complex web of ropes, cables, and pulleys that required constant maintenance and intimate knowledge to operate. A skilled crew could adjust the sails to catch even the slightest breeze or quickly reef them when storms threatened. Every line had its purpose and every knot its meaning. In the hands of experienced sailors, these ships could dance across the waves with surprising grace. Navigation was an art as much as a science. Captains relied on compass, chronometer, and sextant to fix their position, but also on their knowledge of currents, weather patterns, and the subtle signs that nature provided. The color of the water might indicate depth, the behavior of seabirds could suggest the proximity of land, and the very smell of the air could warn of approaching storms. Into this world of wind and wave, skill and danger, routine and mystery, sailed the Mary Celeste on what should have been an ordinary November morning. Her captain was confident, her crew experienced, her cargo valuable but not unusual. Nothing in the peaceful departure from New York Harbor suggested that this ship would soon become the most famous ghost ship in maritime history. But the sea, as we shall discover, had other plans for the Mary Celeste and all who sailed aboard her. Chapter 2. The Birth of a Ship. Every ship has a soul, sailors say, forged in the moment her keel is first laid and her timbers joined. Some vessels are born under lucky stars, destined for long and prosperous careers carrying cargo safely across the world's oceans. Others seem cursed from the very beginning, attracting misfortune like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The ship that would become known as the Mary Celeste was born in the shipyards of Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, in the spring of 1861. Originally christened the Amazon, she emerged from those maritime workshops as a fine example of a merchant brigantine. At 282 tons and 103 feet in length, she was neither the largest nor the smallest of her kind, but her builders crafted her with care and pride. Her hull was built from birch and pine, materials chosen for their strength and flexibility in rough seas. Yet from her very first voyage, the Amazon seemed to attract trouble like metal to a magnet. Her maiden captain, Robert McClellan, fell ill during the ship's initial journey and died before they could reach port. It was an ominous beginning for any vessel, but the Amazon's trials were just beginning. Under her second captain, the ship suffered a collision in the English Channel, damage severe enough to require extensive repairs in a foreign port. The costs mounted, and whispers began to follow the Amazon from harbor to harbor. Sailors are superstitious by nature, and word spreads quickly through the maritime community when a ship develops a reputation for bad luck. The accidents continued with disturbing regularity. During one voyage, the Amazon ran aground in the Bay of Fundy, her hull scraping against rocks that should have been easily avoided in clear weather. Another captain found himself dealing with a cargo fire that filled the hold with choking smoke, forcing the crew to fight flames while battling heavy seas. Each incident added another layer to the ship's growing reputation as a vessel marked by misfortune. By 1868, the Amazon had changed hands several times, each owner eager to be rid of her after experiencing their own share of troubles. She sat idle in port for months at a time, her rigging deteriorating in the salt air, her hull gathering barnacles as potential buyers passed her by with knowing shakes of their heads. But ships, like people, sometimes get second chances. In late 1868, a consortium of American businessmen saw opportunity where others saw only bad luck. Led by James Winchester, a respected shipping merchant from New York, they purchased the Amazon at what must have seemed like a bargain price. Perhaps they didn't believe in the superstitions that had plagued the vessel, or perhaps they simply saw past the rumors to the solid craftsmanship underneath. The new owners decided a fresh start required a new name. Maritime tradition holds that renaming a ship can be risky business, potentially angering the sea gods who knew the vessel by her original name. But sometimes a complete transformation is necessary to break free from the past. They chose Mary Celeste, a name that rolled off the tongue like a gentle prayer, soft and melodic where Amazon had been sharp and martial. Under American registry and with her new identity, the Mary Celeste began what seemed like a more peaceful chapter of her existence. The ship underwent extensive renovations at her new owner's expense. Her rigging was renewed, her deck planking replaced where necessary, and her interior fitted out with improved accommodations for captain and crew. She was painted in fresh colors, her brass fittings polished until they gleamed in the sunlight. For a few years, the rechristened vessel seemed to have shed her cursed reputation. She completed several successful voyages across the Atlantic, carrying varied cargoes from lumber to manufactured goods. Her captains reported no unusual incidents. Her crews spoke well of her seaworthiness, and her owners began to see a return on their investment. Yet, those who knew ships and the sea might have noticed subtle signs that the Mary Celeste's troubles were not entirely behind her. There were small incidents, easily explained away, but troubling in their persistence. Equipment failures that seemed to occur more often than normal. Navigation instruments that gave inconsistent readings. A tendency for experienced sailors to find excuses to leave her crew before long voyages. By 1872, the Mary Celeste had found a measure of stability under the command of Captain Benjamin Briggs, a man whose reputation for competence and integrity seemed to balance whatever lingering curse might have followed the ship from her Amazon days. Under his careful management, she had completed several profitable voyages without incident. But as we shall see, some destinies cannot be escaped through simple acts of will or faith. The Mary Celeste might have carried a new name and sailed under a different flag. But the sea remembers everything, and some stories are written in currents that run deeper than any human intention. The stage was now set for the events that would transform this ordinary merchant vessel into maritime legend, ensuring that the name Mary Celeste would be whispered by sailors and landlubbers alike for generations to come. Chapter 3. Captain Benjamin Briggs. In the world of merchant shipping, a captain's reputation was his most valuable asset. It determined which ships he could command, which cargoes owners would trust to his care, and which crews would follow him into the uncertainties of the open ocean. By all accounts, Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs possessed exactly the kind of character that inspired confidence in both business partners and sailors alike. Born in 1835 on Breed's Island, just off the Massachusetts coast, Briggs had salt water in his veins from his earliest days. His father, Nathan Briggs, was himself a sea captain, and the family had been connected to maritime trade for generations. Young Benjamin learned to read the wind and waves before he could properly read books, spent his childhood summers aboard his father's vessels, and absorbed the ancient wisdom of the sea through daily exposure to its moods and mysteries. What set Captain Briggs apart from many of his contemporaries was not just his seamanship, but his moral character. In an age when ship captains often ruled through intimidation and harsh discipline, Briggs was known for his quiet authority and fair treatment of his crews. He was a deeply religious man, a member of the Congregational Church who began each voyage with prayer and maintained daily devotions even in the roughest weather. His personal journal, which would later become crucial evidence in the mystery that followed, was filled with observations about the weather, navigation notes, and expressions of gratitude for divine protection. Sailors respected him not just for his piety, but for his competence. Briggs could navigate by dead reckoning through fog so thick you couldn't see the bow from the stern. He could sense changes in weather patterns hours before they appeared on the horizon. Most importantly, he brought his ships home safely, voyage after voyage, in an era when maritime insurance companies kept careful tallies of which captains lost vessels and which ones delivered their cargoes intact. In 1862, Briggs married Sarah Elizabeth Cobb, a woman whose own family understood the rhythms of maritime life. Sarah was not content to remain ashore while her husband sailed distant seas. She possessed the rare combination of courage and practicality that made her an ideal companion for a life that moved between ports and continents. Unlike many captains' wives who feared the ocean's unpredictability, Sarah found peace in the endless horizons and took active interest in navigation and ship management. Their marriage was blessed with children, but tragedy had already touched their lives in ways that would make their final voyage even more poignant. Their first son, Arthur, had died in infancy, a loss that drew the couple closer together and deepened their faith. Their daughter, Sophia Matilda, born in 1870, had become the light of their lives, a precocious child who charmed everyone she met with her quick wit and fearless nature. When families sailed together, ships became floating homes with their own unique rhythms. Sarah would establish routines that brought comfort and normalcy to life at sea. She maintained a small garden of herbs in pots on deck, tended to the crew's minor medical needs, and created a warm, domestic space in the captain's cabin that made even the most hardened sailors nostalgic for their own homes. Little Sophia treated the ship as her personal playground. She knew every rope and sail by name, could tie basic knots before she could properly write her letters, and was completely at ease with the constant motion that left many adult passengers green and miserable. The crew doted on her, carving small toys from scraps of wood and telling her stories of distant ports where exotic birds sang in languages nobody could understand. Captain Briggs surrounded himself with officers and crew members he trusted implicitly. His first mate, Albert Richardson, was a steady and experienced sailor who had served with Briggs on previous voyages. Richardson was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to maintain discipline without resorting to harsh measures. The two men worked together like a well-balanced team, each understanding his role and responsibilities without need for lengthy discussion. The crew of 7 men were all experienced hands, chosen by Briggs personally for their skills and reliability. There was Volkert Lorentzen, a German immigrant who served as cook but was also skilled in sail repair. Boz Lorentzen, possibly Volkert's brother, worked as able seaman. Arian Martens, another German, brought years of experience on Atlantic routes. Gottlieb Godschall served as steward, responsible for maintaining the ship's stores and assisting Sarah with domestic arrangements. These were not desperate men seeking any berth available, but skilled professionals who had chosen to sail with Captain Briggs because of his reputation for fair treatment and safe voyages. They were men with families of their own, some with wives and children waiting for their return. Each had his own reasons for going to sea, his own dreams of what he might do with his share of the voyage's profits. What made this particular crew remarkable was their harmony. There were no obvious personality conflicts, no troublemakers who might foment dissent during long days at sea. Briggs had created what every captain dreamed of, a tight-knit group of professionals who could work together efficiently in any weather, who looked out for each other's safety, and who shared a common goal of bringing their ship safely to port. As November 1872 approached, and the Mary Celeste prepared for what would become her most famous voyage, Captain Briggs had every reason for optimism. His ship was seaworthy, his crew reliable, his cargo valuable but not dangerous. The weather report suggested favorable conditions for an Atlantic crossing, and the Mediterranean markets were hungry for American goods. Sarah was excited about the prospect of seeing Genoa, where Briggs had promised to show her the ancient churches and bustling markets that made each port a new adventure. Yet, Captain Briggs was also a cautious man who understood that the sea's moods could change without warning. He carried extra provisions, maintained emergency equipment in perfect condition, and always planned for contingencies that might never arise. It was this combination of optimism and prudence that had kept him alive through decades of ocean voyaging. None of them could have imagined that within a month, the Mary Celeste would be found drifting empty, under full sail, her cargo intact, her structure undamaged, but every soul aboard vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. Chapter 4. Setting Sail. The morning of November 7th, 1872, dawned crisp and clear over New York Harbor, with the kind of steady breeze that made experienced sailors smile with anticipation. The Mary Celeste lay at Pier 50 on the East River, her holds nearly full with a cargo that would prove both valuable and, some would later argue, dangerously volatile. 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol filled the ship's belly, bound for the distilleries of Genoa, Italy. This industrial alcohol, rendered unfit for drinking by the addition of methanol and other chemicals, was a common cargo on Atlantic routes. It was used in the production of perfumes, medicines, and various manufactured goods that European markets demanded in ever-increasing quantities. The barrels were secured with practiced care, each one positioned and braced to prevent shifting during the inevitable rough weather they would encounter crossing the Atlantic in late autumn. Captain Briggs had overseen the loading personally, walking through the hold with a lantern to inspect the stowage, checking that each barrel was properly sealed and that the cargo was distributed evenly to maintain the ship's stability. He was particularly careful about this cargo, knowing that alcohol fumes could accumulate in enclosed spaces, creating both fire hazards and health risks for his crew. The holds were well ventilated, and he had given strict orders about open flames and smoking near the storage areas. The final preparations had taken several days, each detail attended to with the methodical care that separated successful voyages from disasters. Fresh water casks were filled to capacity, the ship's stores packed with salt pork, hardtack, dried beans, and the other staples that would sustain them during the 4 to 6 weeks they expected to spend at sea. Sarah had added her own touches to the provisions, including preserves and medicines that would make life aboard more comfortable for everyone. The weather glass showed steady pressure, and the harbor pilot reported favorable conditions for departure. A moderate westerly wind promised to carry them swiftly past Sandy Hook and into the open Atlantic, where they could set a course for the Azores and then on to the Mediterranean. The Mary Celeste was fully provisioned for a voyage of 2 months if necessary, though Briggs expected to make better time than that if the winds proved cooperative. As departure approached, there were the inevitable last-minute details and farewells. Letters were handed to friends who would remain ashore, final business arrangements confirmed with Winchester and his partners, and personal belongings secured in the family's cabin. Sarah had packed carefully for the journey, including warm clothing for the Atlantic crossing, and lighter garments for the Mediterranean climate they would find in Genoa. Little Sophia was beside herself with excitement, chattering constantly about the dolphins she hoped to see and the foreign ports they would visit. She had a small bag of her own possessions, carefully packed with her favorite doll, picture books, and the collection of shells and interesting stones she had gathered from previous voyages. The crew indulged her enthusiasm, promising to teach her new knots and show her how to identify different types of clouds. There was something particularly optimistic about this departure, a sense of adventure and possibility that infected everyone aboard. The Mary Celeste had been performing well under Captain Briggs's command. The crew was experienced and harmonious, and the cargo represented a profitable venture for all concerned. Even the ship herself seemed eager to be underway, her rigging taut and ready, her fresh paint gleaming in the morning sun. Captain Briggs made his final entries in the ship's log before departure, noting the weather conditions, the state of the cargo, and the names of all souls aboard. His handwriting was neat and precise, the careful script of a man who understood that these records might someday be crucial for insurance claims, legal proceedings, or simply for the satisfaction of completing a job properly done. He recorded the wind direction and strength, the barometric pressure, and his intended course toward the Azores. The harbor pilot came aboard to guide them through the complex channels and traffic of New York's busy waterfront. Steam tugs and sailing vessels of every description crowded the waters, creating a maze of movement that required expert navigation to avoid collisions. The Mary Celeste moved slowly at first, her crew adjusting the sails to catch the harbor breeze, while avoiding the wash from passing steamers. As they cleared the harbor and entered the broader waters of the Atlantic approaches, the pilot was transferred to his small boat, and the Mary Celeste was finally free to pursue her destiny. Captain Briggs ordered more sail set, and the ship responded eagerly, her bow cutting through the moderate swells with the graceful motion of a vessel built for ocean travel. Sarah stood at the stern rail with Sophia, watching the Manhattan skyline grow smaller behind them. The city's church spires and commercial buildings gradually faded into a gray line on the horizon, then disappeared entirely as the Mary Celeste settled into the long swells of the open ocean. Ahead lay 3,000 miles of water, weeks of sailing through weather fair and foul, and the promise of profitable business in Italian ports. The crew settled into the familiar routines of ocean voyaging, organizing themselves into watches, checking and adjusting the rigging, and beginning the daily maintenance tasks that would occupy them throughout the journey. There was work to be done, but also time for conversation, rest, and the simple pleasure of a well-found ship moving efficiently through her natural element. None of them could have foreseen that this routine departure would be the last time the Mary Celeste would be seen with living souls aboard. In less than a month, she would be discovered drifting abandoned, her cargo virtually intact, her structure undamaged, but her crew, captain, and passengers vanished into thin air. The mystery that would begin on this bright November morning would outlive everyone who witnessed their departure, becoming one of the sea's most enduring and haunting questions. But for now, in these final hours of normalcy, the Mary Celeste sailed on through fair weather and following seas, carrying her human cargo toward a fate that remains unexplained to this very day. Chapter 5. Life on board. Life aboard a merchant vessel in 1872 followed rhythms as ancient and predictable as the tides themselves. The Mary Celeste, now 3 days out from New York, had settled into the comfortable routines that would govern every aspect of existence for the weeks ahead. The ship's bell marked the passage of time in 4-hour watches, its bronze voice cutting through wind and wave to organize the lives of everyone aboard. The crew worked in 2 main watches, with half the men on duty while the others rested. This system ensured that the ship was always properly manned, with experienced hands ready to adjust sails when the wind shifted, to spot other vessels in the shipping lanes, or to respond quickly if equipment failed. First, Mate Richardson took the morning watch, his steady presence on deck a reassuring constant as the ship moved deeper into the Atlantic. Captain Briggs maintained his own schedule, independent of the regular watch system, but intimately connected to every aspect of the ship's operation. He would appear on deck at dawn to check the weather and their position, consult with Richardson about any changes needed in sail configuration, and make the careful observations that would be recorded in the ship's log. His navigation required constant attention in an age before radio beacons or satellite positioning, when a ship's location was determined by the sun, stars, and dead reckoning calculations that accumulated small errors with each passing day. The Mary Celeste's interior spaces were compact, but efficiently organized, designed to maximize utility while providing basic comfort for those who would call the ship home for weeks at a time. The captain's cabin, located in the stern, was the largest single space aboard, fitted with a proper bed, a chart table, and storage for the numerous instruments, books, and personal belongings that a prudent captain carried on ocean voyages. Sarah had transformed this cabin into a genuine home, arranging their possessions with the care of someone who understood that small comforts became magnified in importance during long sea voyages. She had hung curtains to soften the harsh lines of the ship's construction, arranged books on shelves that could withstand the constant motion, and created a play area where little Sophia could pursue her childhood games safely below deck when the weather turned rough. The ship's galley, presided over by Volkert Lawrenson, occupied a central position that allowed the cook to serve meals regardless of weather conditions. Lawrenson was skilled in the particular art of preparing food at sea, where every pot and pan had to be secured against the ship's motion, where fresh ingredients were precious and carefully rationed, and where the ability to provide hot meals could mean the difference between a contented crew and a mutinous one. Meals aboard the Mary Celeste followed a simple but nourishing pattern. Breakfast typically consisted of coffee, hardtack, and salt pork, supplemented when possible with eggs from the small flock of chickens they carried in coops on deck. The midday meal might feature beans or peas from the ship's stores, perhaps enhanced with onions that Sarah had insisted on bringing for their anti-scorbutic properties. Evening meals often centered around whatever preserved meat was available, served with the eternal hardtack and washed down with coffee that grew progressively weaker as they moved farther from port. Water was precious aboard any ocean-going vessel, carefully rationed and jealously guarded. The Mary Celeste carried enough for drinking, cooking, and basic washing, but there was never enough for true luxury. Bathing was accomplished with seawater when weather permitted, a refreshing but never entirely satisfactory substitute for the fresh water baths that everyone looked forward to at the journey's end. The crew's quarters, located forward, were Spartan but functional. Each man had a narrow bunk with storage space for his personal possessions, and the communal area provided space for meals, games, and the conversations that helped pass the long hours between watches. These men had learned to live in close proximity, without friction, understanding that personality conflicts in such confined spaces could quickly escalate into serious problems. During off-watch hours, the sailors pursued various activities to occupy their minds and hands. Some worked on personal projects, carving small items from pieces of wood or mending their clothing, with the careful stitches of men who knew that replacement garments were thousands of miles away. Others read books from the ship's small library, shared stories of previous voyages, or played card games that could stretch for hours when the weather was fair and the ship sailed herself. Little Sophia brought a unique energy to life aboard the Mary Celeste. She moved freely throughout the ship, equally at home in her parents' cabin, chatting with the cook in his galley or watching the sailors work on deck. Her presence softened the rough edges of maritime life, reminding everyone of the families and normal existence they had temporarily left behind. The crew members told her stories of their own children, taught her simple knots and basic seamanship, and included her in their daily routines whenever it was safe to do so. Sarah maintained her own schedule of activities, managing the domestic aspects of their floating home while also taking active interest in the ship's operation. She could read basic navigation instruments, understood weather signs well enough to anticipate changes in conditions, and possessed the practical skills necessary for life at sea. Her herb garden in small pots on deck provided fresh seasonings for the cook and remedies for minor ailments that inevitably arose during long voyages. The ship's routine was punctuated by regular maintenance tasks that kept the Mary Celeste in proper sailing condition. Sails required constant attention, with small tears mended immediately before they could grow into major problems. The rigging needed daily inspection, with worn lines replaced and all connections checked for security. The deck required holy stoning to keep it clean and safe, while the brass fittings needed polishing to prevent corrosion in the salt air. Navigation occupied a central place in Captain Briggs's daily routine. Each clear day provided opportunities to take sunsights with his sextant, carefully measuring the angle between the horizon and the sun at precisely noon to determine their latitude. Star sights in the evening twilight allowed him to fix their longitude, though this required more complex calculations and precise timing with his chronometer. Dead reckoning filled the gaps when clouds obscured the sky, using compass headings, estimated speed, and careful attention to currents and wind drift to maintain an approximate idea of their position. The ship's log became a detailed record of their progress, with entries every few hours noting wind direction and strength, weather conditions, sail changes, and any unusual events. Captain Briggs wrote in his careful hand, knowing that these records might someday be scrutinized by insurance investigators, port authorities, or maritime courts. His final entries, made sometime in the last week of November, would become some of the most analyzed documents in maritime history. As the Mary Celeste sailed eastward through the November seas, her company settled into the comfortable rhythms of ocean voyaging. The weather remained generally favorable, with moderate winds and no serious storms to test either ship or crew. There was every reason to expect a routine passage to Genoa, profitable business in the Mediterranean, and safe return to American ports. But somewhere in the vast expanse of the Atlantic, something would go terribly wrong. What happened to disrupt this peaceful routine remains one of history's greatest maritime mysteries, a puzzle that has defied solution for more than 150 years. Chapter 6. Across the Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean in late November holds a particular kind of beauty, harsh and magnificent in equal measure. As the Mary Celeste sailed deeper into these waters, the crew witnessed the daily spectacle of sunrise and sunset painting the endless horizon in shades of gold and crimson that no landlubber could ever truly imagine. The nights brought star fields of such clarity and brilliance that they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky, celestial navigation aids that had guided sailors for thousands of years. Day followed day in the gentle rhythm that marks successful ocean passages. The wind held steady from the west and southwest, filling the Mary Celeste's sails with the kind of consistent pressure that allowed her to maintain good speed while riding comfortably over the long Atlantic swells. Captain Briggs noted in his log that they were making better time than he had initially hoped, covering distances that put them well ahead of his most optimistic estimates. The ship's company had settled into the easy camaraderie that develops when people live in close quarters under pleasant circumstances. Meals in the captain's cabin had become social occasions where Sarah and Benjamin discussed their plans for Genoa, while little Sophia chattered about everything she observed. The crew members, relieved of the constant anxiety that marked voyages in rough weather, found time for the small pleasures that made sea life bearable. Volkert Lorentzen had proven particularly skilled at making the most of their provisions, creating meals that went far beyond mere sustenance. He had discovered that Sarah's herb collection, combined with his own knowledge of ship's cooking, could transform even salt pork and hardtack into something approaching enjoyable cuisine. The aroma of his cooking drifted across the deck during meal preparation, a homey smell that made everyone think of kitchens and families waiting ashore. The weather glass remained steady, showing none of the dramatic drops in pressure that would herald the approach of serious storms. The wind direction varied slightly from day to day, requiring occasional adjustments to the sail plan, but nothing that challenged the crew's seamanship or threatened the ship's progress. If anything, conditions were almost too perfect, the kind of sailing weather that experienced mariners knew to appreciate because it could change without warning. Captain Briggs maintained his careful navigation routine, taking sun sights whenever the sky was clear and working out their position with the methodical precision that had earned him his reputation for reliability. His calculations showed them following a course that would take them well clear of the major shipping lanes while still benefiting from favorable currents and prevailing winds. They were alone in the vastness of the ocean, exactly as a prudent captain would plan for a voyage of this nature. The ship's log entries from this period reveal a kind of maritime contentment that speaks to everything going according to plan. Wind speeds, directions, and weather conditions were all recorded with Captain Briggs's characteristic attention to detail. Sail changes were noted, course corrections logged, and the ship's position calculated and recorded twice daily. These entries would later be scrutinized by investigators searching for any clue that might explain what happened next. Sarah had established her own routines during these peaceful days at sea. She spent morning hours on deck when weather permitted, tending her small collection of potted herbs and enjoying the fresh air that was one of the few luxuries available aboard ship. Afternoons might find her reading in the cabin or working on needlework that would help pass the long hours. She had brought several books for the voyage, including works of poetry and philosophy that provided mental stimulation during the quiet periods between watches. Little Sophia had adapted to ship life with the easy flexibility of childhood, treating the Mary Celeste as her personal kingdom and its crew as devoted subjects. She knew every member of the ship's company by name, understood the basic functions of sails and rigging, and could predict weather changes almost as well as the experienced sailors around her. Her laughter echoed across the deck during fair weather, a sound that reminded everyone why they worked so hard to bring their ships safely home. The crew members pursued their own interests during off-duty hours, some carving small items from pieces of wood, others mending clothing or equipment with the careful attention that marked good sailors everywhere. There were card games in the evening, stories shared during dog watches, and the kind of gentle conversation that develops among men who respect each other and share common goals. Navigation during this period required constant attention despite the favorable conditions. Captain Briggs used every clear day to take sun sights, carefully measuring the angle between the horizon and the sun at precisely local noon to determine their latitude. Evening star sights provided longitude fixes when atmospheric conditions allowed, though clouds sometimes interfered with these more complex observations. Dead reckoning filled the gaps, using compass courses, estimated speeds, and allowances for current and wind drift to maintain an approximate position between celestial fixes. The ship's course took them gradually eastward and slightly southward, following the great circle route that represented the shortest distance to their destination, while avoiding the worst weather, typically found in higher latitudes during late autumn. They were making for the Azores, those Portuguese islands that had served as waypoints for Atlantic travelers for centuries, where they could take on fresh water and make any repairs needed before the final push to Genoa. As November drew toward its close, the Mary Celeste continued her steady progress across the Atlantic. Her crew was healthy, her cargo secure, her structure sound, and her destination clearly defined. Captain Briggs had every reason to be satisfied with their voyage so far, and his log entries reflected the confidence of a man who understood his business and saw no cause for concern. Yet, it was during these final days of normal operation that something began to go wrong. The exact nature of that something remains unknown, hidden in the gap between Captain Briggs's last log entry and the moment when the Mary Celeste was found drifting empty under full sail. Whatever happened occurred so quickly, or seemed so manageable initially, that it left no record in the ship's documentation. The last entry in the ship's log, made in Captain Briggs's familiar handwriting, noted fair weather, moderate winds, and their position approximately 400 miles east of the Azores. It was a routine entry, identical in tone and content to dozens of others he had made during the voyage. There was no hint of approaching danger, no suggestion that anything unusual was about to occur. But within days of that final entry, the Mary Celeste would be discovered sailing under full canvas with no living soul aboard, her cargo intact, her structure undamaged, and her crew, captain, and passengers vanished as completely as if the ocean had swallowed them without leaving a trace. Chapter 7. The Drifting Brigantine. December 4th, 1872, dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes the Atlantic seem like a vast mirror reflecting the pale winter sky. Captain David Reed Morehouse of the brigantine Dei Gratia stood on his quarterdeck, scanning the horizon through his spyglass, as had become his habit during the morning watch. The sea was unusually calm for December, with long, gentle swells that barely disturbed the surface of the water. Morehouse was an experienced mariner, a man whose weathered hands had guided ships through Atlantic storms for more than 2 decades. He knew these waters well, understood the patterns of wind and current that governed this part of the ocean, and possessed the kind of intuitive sense for the unusual that kept good captains alive in a profession where small mistakes could have fatal consequences. What caught his attention that morning was a sail configuration that didn't look quite right. About 6 miles to the south, a brigantine was making her way eastward under what appeared to be full canvas. But something about her movement seemed wrong. She was sailing erratically, sometimes pointing toward the wind in a way that suggested no competent helmsman was at her wheel. Her sails, while full of wind, showed signs of damage that any careful captain would have repaired immediately. Morehouse called for his own spyglass to be brought, a more powerful instrument that might reveal details invisible to the naked eye. Through its lens, he could see that the distant vessel was indeed in distress of some kind. Her jib was missing entirely, torn away by forces that could only be guessed at. Other sails showed rents and tears that spoke of severe weather or some other catastrophe that had left the ship sailing under damaged canvas. But what struck Morehouse as most peculiar was the absence of any human activity on the other ship's deck. Even at this distance, he should have been able to see figures moving about, sailors tending to the rigging or officers taking observations. The brigantine appeared to be sailing herself, guided only by the wind and the last course setting that someone had given to her wheel before what? Captain Morehouse ordered his own ship to change course toward the mysterious vessel. The Dei Gratia responded to her helm, her crew making the sail adjustments necessary to intercept the other brigantine on its wandering course. As they drew closer, details became visible that made the situation even more puzzling and disturbing. The name on the stern was clearly readable now: Mary Celeste. Morehouse knew that name, had indeed shared drinks with her captain, Benjamin Briggs, just weeks earlier in New York before both ships had departed on their respective voyages. Briggs was a careful, competent sailor, not the sort of man who would leave his ship sailing unmanned under any circumstances that Morehouse could imagine. As the distance between the two ships shortened, other details became apparent. The Mary Celeste's wheel was spinning freely, controlled by no human hand. Her compass binnacle was damaged, the instrument itself apparently smashed by some impact that could have been either accidental or deliberate. Most unsettling of all, there was no sign of life anywhere aboard the vessel. No movement on deck, no faces at the windows of the deckhouse, no response to the Dei Gratia's signals. Morehouse hailed the Mary Celeste repeatedly, his voice carrying across the calm water with the authority of one sea captain addressing another. The traditional calls that should have brought an immediate response echoed unanswered across the empty deck. Even if the crew was below deck, someone should have heard his shouts and come topside to respond. The silence was complete and deeply unsettling. The decision to board an apparently abandoned vessel was not one that Captain Morehouse made lightly. Maritime law was complex regarding salvage rights, and there were significant legal and financial implications to consider. But his immediate concern was humanitarian. If there were injured or sick people aboard the Mary Celeste, they needed help immediately, regardless of legal complications that might arise later. Morehouse selected 3 of his most reliable men for the boarding party: Oliver DeVoe, his first mate, and a man of considerable experience in maritime emergencies; John Wright, a seaman known for his calm head and careful observations; and Charles Lund, whose mechanical skills might prove useful if the Mary Celeste had suffered equipment failures that stranded her crew below deck. The sea was calm enough to allow the Dei Gratia to approach within hailing distance, and a small boat was lowered to carry the boarding party across the narrow gap between the two vessels. As they rowed toward the Mary Celeste, the men could see that her hull appeared undamaged, her rigging largely intact despite the torn sails, and her general condition surprisingly good for a vessel that was clearly in some kind of distress. The silence that greeted them as they climbed aboard was profound and eerie. Their footsteps on the deck seemed unnaturally loud in the absence of the usual sounds of shipboard life. No creaking of rigging under strain, no voices calling orders or making conversation, no sounds of cooking or other domestic activities that should have been audible from the galley and living quarters. First Mate DeVoe moved methodically through the ship, checking each compartment with the thoroughness of an experienced sailor who understood that lives might depend on what he found. The crew's quarters were empty but showed no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Personal belongings remained in their proper places. Clothing hung neatly from hooks, and the general organization suggested that whatever had happened had not involved panic or violence. The captain's cabin told a similar story of normalcy, interrupted without explanation. Captain Briggs's navigation instruments were in their proper places, his charts spread on the table as if he had been plotting a course moments earlier. There were signs that a family had been living here. Woman's clothing in the wardrobe, a child's toys scattered about, personal effects that spoke of people who expected to return to claim them. But of Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, little Sophia, and the 7 crew members who had sailed from New York with such high hopes just weeks earlier, there was no trace. The Mary Celeste had become a ghost ship in the most literal sense, carrying only the memories of those who had once called her home. What had happened to transform a routine merchant voyage into maritime history's greatest mystery. The boarding party from the Dei Gratia was about to discover clues that would only deepen the puzzle, evidence that would spawn theories and speculation that continue to this very day. Chapter 8. Inside the Mary Celeste. The first thing that struck Oliver Deveau as he descended into the Mary Celeste's main cabin was how utterly normal everything appeared. Sunlight filtered through the stern windows, illuminating a scene of domestic tranquility that seemed frozen in time. Sarah Briggs' sewing basket sat open on the table, needle and thread still attached to a piece of fabric, as if she had simply stepped away for a moment and would return at any instant to continue her work. In the captain's quarters, Deveau found Captain Briggs's sea chest open, his clothes neatly folded and arranged as they would be in any well-ordered home. Personal letters lay on the writing desk, some opened and others still sealed, suggesting that mail had been sorted and read in the normal course of shipboard routine. A bottle of cough medicine stood on the washstand, its contents indicating that someone aboard had been treating a minor ailment with the careful attention typical of life at sea, where small problems could become serious without proper care. Little Sophia's presence was everywhere in the family quarters. Her small dresses hung in miniature alongside her mother's clothing, tiny shoes arranged beneath them in perfect order. Children's books lay open on a chair, their pages showing the wear that comes from repeated reading during long days at sea. A collection of shells and smooth stones, the treasures that fascinate young minds, was carefully arranged on a shelf where they could be admired without being lost to the ship's motion. The galley told its own story of interrupted routine. Volkert Lawrenson's cooking area was clean and well organized, with pots and utensils secured in their proper places against the ship's movement. The stove was cold, but provisions were laid out as if preparations for the next meal had been underway when something caused them to be abandoned. Barrels of fresh water stood 3/4 full, more than adequate for the remainder of the voyage to Genoa. Most puzzling of all was the cargo hold, where the 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol remained virtually undisturbed. A few barrels showed signs of damage, their contents having leaked into the bilge where the fumes would have created both a fire hazard and potential health risks for anyone working below deck. But the overwhelming majority of the cargo was exactly as it had been stowed in New York, properly secured, and showing no evidence of shifting that might have created dangerous conditions. The ship's papers were found in Captain Briggs's cabin, properly maintained and showing no irregularities that might explain the abandonment. The manifest listed every barrel of cargo. The crew roster included all hands who had departed New York, and the clearance documents were stamped and signed by the appropriate authorities. Everything was exactly as it should be for a legitimate merchant voyage proceeding according to plan. But there were disturbing details that suggested something had gone seriously wrong in the final hours before the ship was abandoned. The ship's chronometer, that essential instrument for determining longitude, was missing from its customary place in the captain's cabin. Without it, precise navigation would have been impossible, though the ship could still have been sailed by dead reckoning and compass courses. The ship's lifeboat was gone, its davits empty, and showing clear evidence that it had been launched rather than torn away by storm or accident. The boat's removal appeared to have been deliberate, suggesting that at least some of the people aboard the Mary Celeste had left the ship intentionally, rather than being swept away by natural forces. Water had entered the ship, though not in quantities that would have threatened her seaworthiness. About 3.5 feet of water sloshed in the bilge. More than would accumulate from normal sources, but far less than would indicate serious hull damage. The pumps were functional, but had apparently been abandoned before they could clear the excess water. Another puzzling detail that raised more questions than it answered. The condition of the rigging told a complex story that experienced sailors could read like text. Some sails had been blown out or torn, damage consistent with severe weather, or possibly with the ship being left to sail herself without proper attention to changing conditions. But other rigging remained in good order, suggesting that whatever had happened had not involved a sustained period of neglect or storm damage. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the absence of any signs of violence or struggle. There were no bloodstains, no evidence of weapons being used, no indication that pirates or mutineers had seized control of the vessel. Personal valuables remained undisturbed, including items that would have been attractive to anyone interested in theft. If the Mary Celeste had been the victim of criminal activity, it was unlike any piracy that maritime authorities had ever encountered. The ship's cat was gone, a detail that experienced sailors found particularly significant. Cats were valued members of ship's companies, not only for their ability to control rats, but as companions whose presence brought comfort during long voyages. A cat would not willingly leave a ship, and its absence suggested that whatever had caused the human abandonment had been so sudden or so complete that there had been no opportunity to save even the most cherished of shipboard pets. DeVoe and his companions spent several hours conducting their examination, documenting every detail that might provide clues to the Mary Celeste's mystery. They found evidence of hasty departure, drawers pulled out and left open, items scattered in ways that suggested quick searching for particular objects, but nothing that clearly indicated what had motivated such urgent action. The forward hatch had been removed and lay on the deck, creating an opening through which cargo could be examined or potentially dangerous fumes could escape. This detail would later fuel speculation that concerns about the alcohol cargo might have played a role in the abandonment, though the actual condition of the barrels suggested that any such concerns would have been largely unfounded. As the afternoon wore on and their investigation continued, the boarding party from the De Gratia began to appreciate the full magnitude of the mystery they had encountered. Here was a seaworthy ship with valuable cargo, abandoned by experienced sailors under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Whatever had caused Captain Briggs and his companions to leave the Mary Celeste had been something unprecedented in the experience of men who had faced every hazard that ocean travel could present. The evidence they gathered would be scrutinized by maritime courts, insurance investigators, and amateur detectives for decades to come. Every detail would be analyzed, every theory tested against the facts as they could be determined. But more than 150 years later, the Mary Celeste continues to guard her secrets, offering tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers to the question that has haunted maritime history since that December morning when she was found sailing alone through the calm Atlantic swells. Chapter 9. The Gibraltar Inquiry. The ancient fortress city of Gibraltar had witnessed countless maritime dramas over the centuries, but few arrivals had generated as much curiosity and speculation as the Mary Celeste's entrance into the harbor on December 13, 1872. Word of the ghost ship had preceded her, carried by the maritime telegraph that connected ports across the Mediterranean, and crowds gathered along the waterfront to catch a glimpse of the vessel that had sailed herself across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Captain Morehouse had made the difficult decision to claim salvage rights over the Mary Celeste, a choice that would prove both legally complex and financially disappointing. Under maritime law, any vessel found abandoned at sea could be claimed by those who rescued her, but the process required formal legal proceedings that could take months to resolve. The Mary Celeste would remain under the jurisdiction of the Gibraltar Vice Admiralty Court, while her fate was decided. The court proceedings began under the direction of Sir James Cochrane, the Gibraltar Attorney General, a man whose experience in maritime law was matched by his skepticism about the story presented by Captain Morehouse and his crew. The circumstances of the Mary Celeste's abandonment were so unusual, so completely without precedent in Cochrane's long career, that he suspected fraud, conspiracy, or criminal activity of some kind. The inquiry room in Gibraltar's colonial courthouse became the stage for one of the most thorough maritime investigations of the 19th century. Every member of the De Gratia's crew who had participated in the boarding was questioned extensively, their testimonies recorded in meticulous detail, and cross-examined for inconsistencies that might reveal hidden motives or criminal intent. Oliver DeVoe, the first mate who had led the boarding party, found himself subjected to particularly intensive questioning. His description of the Mary Celeste's condition was analyzed sentence by sentence, with investigators searching for any detail that might suggest the ship had been deliberately sabotaged or that her cargo had been partially looted. DeVoe's testimony was consistent and detailed, but the very completeness of his observations seemed to fuel official suspicions rather than allay them. The court called upon maritime experts to examine every aspect of the Mary Celeste's condition, from her hull integrity to the state of her rigging. Survey after survey confirmed that the ship was fundamentally sound, capable of completing her voyage to Genoa without major repairs. The cargo of industrial alcohol was largely intact, with only minor losses that could be attributed to normal handling damage or the effects of rough weather during the Atlantic crossing. But it was precisely this lack of obvious damage that made the case so puzzling to the legal minds attempting to resolve it. Ships were abandoned at sea for clear reasons: fire, collision, severe storm damage, or piracy. The Mary Celeste showed evidence of none of these catastrophes, yet her experienced crew had apparently chosen to leave a seaworthy vessel and trust their lives to a small boat on the open Atlantic in December weather. Attorney General Cochrane pursued several theories with the dogged persistence of a prosecutor convinced that the truth was being deliberately concealed. His first suspicion focused on possible collusion between the crews of the Mary Celeste and the De Gratia. Captain Morehouse and Captain Briggs had known each other, had shared meals and conversations in New York before their respective departures. Could they have conspired to stage the abandonment as an elaborate insurance fraud? The financial records were examined in exhaustive detail, searching for evidence of unusual debts, secret agreements, or other monetary motivations that might have driven respected sea captains to criminal behavior. The Mary Celeste was insured for $14,000, a substantial sum, but not extraordinary for a vessel of her size and cargo capacity. The cargo carried additional insurance that would be paid regardless of the ship's fate, reducing any financial incentive for the owners to orchestrate her disappearance. Cochrane's second line of inquiry focused on the possibility of mutiny, followed by the murder of Captain Briggs and his family. The crew roster was analyzed for men with criminal backgrounds or histories of violence, but the investigation revealed that Captain Briggs had chosen his subordinates carefully. These were experienced, reliable sailors with families of their own, men who had sailed with Briggs on previous voyages without incident. The absence of any bloodstains or signs of violence aboard the Mary Celeste undermined the mutiny theory, but Cochrane pressed forward with questions about whether the bodies could have been disposed of at sea after the ship was taken. This line of speculation required the court to imagine scenarios so elaborate and unlikely that even the most suspicious investigators began to doubt their plausibility. A third theory examined the possibility that the Mary Celeste had encountered pirates, though the complete absence of theft made this explanation equally problematic. Pirates who would kill an entire crew but leave valuable cargo untouched, who would take the time to clean up all evidence of violence while ignoring opportunities for profit, defied everything known about maritime criminal behavior. The court also investigated whether the alcohol cargo itself might have played a role in the abandonment. Several barrels had been damaged, and the fumes from industrial alcohol could be both toxic and explosive under certain conditions. Expert testimony suggested that a buildup of vapors in the hold might have created a temporary but serious health hazard, possibly forcing the crew to abandon ship until the danger passed. This theory gained some credibility when investigators noted that the forward hatch had been removed, creating ventilation that could have been intended to clear dangerous fumes from the cargo area. But if fear of explosion or poisoning had motivated the abandonment, why hadn't the crew returned to reclaim their ship once the immediate danger had passed? The Mary Celeste had been drifting for days or perhaps weeks before her discovery, time enough for any temporary hazard to dissipate. Weeks stretched into months as the Gibraltar inquiry continued its methodical examination of every possible explanation. Witnesses were recalled for additional questioning. Experts provided conflicting opinions about technical details, and legal arguments were made and refuted with the thoroughness that characterized Victorian-era jurisprudence. The final verdict, when it came, satisfied no one completely. The court found no evidence of criminal activity, but also acknowledged that the circumstances of the Mary Celeste's abandonment remained unexplained. Captain Morehouse and his crew were awarded salvage rights, though the amount was significantly less than they had hoped for, reduced by the court's lingering suspicions about the unusual nature of their find. The Mary Celeste herself was returned to her owners, who faced the difficult task of finding new crew members willing to sail aboard a ship that had acquired a reputation for supernatural forces and unexplained disappearances. The vessel that had once been simply another merchant brigantine was now infamous, her name associated with mystery and misfortune in the superstitious world of professional sailors. But the Gibraltar inquiry, for all its thoroughness and legal precision, had failed to answer the fundamental question that had brought the Mary Celeste to public attention. What had caused Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, little Sophia, and 7 experienced sailors to abandon a seaworthy ship and disappear without trace into the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean? The court had documented the facts with meticulous care, but the truth behind those facts remained as elusive as morning mist over calm water, drifting just beyond the reach of human understanding. Chapter 10. Theories. Nature's Wrath. In the years that followed the Gibraltar inquiry, maritime experts and amateur investigators alike turned their attention to the forces of nature that might explain the Mary Celeste's mysterious abandonment. The ocean, after all, was capable of phenomena so sudden and violent that even experienced sailors could be caught completely off guard, faced with situations that demanded immediate action to preserve human life. The Atlantic in late November and early December was notorious for its unpredictable weather patterns, where clear skies could give way to savage storms with little warning. Meteorological records from 1872 showed that several significant weather systems had moved through the shipping lanes during the period when the Mary Celeste was making her crossing. Any one of these storms might have created conditions that appeared to threaten the ship's safety, even if the actual danger proved to be temporary. Waterspouts presented one particularly compelling explanation for the abandonment. These marine tornadoes could appear with stunning suddenness, their towering columns of rotating water and air capable of devastating any vessel unlucky enough to encounter them. A waterspout approaching the Mary Celeste might have convinced Captain Briggs that his ship was doomed, prompting him to order everyone into the lifeboat before the phenomenon could destroy their vessel. The psychology of waterspout encounters was well documented in maritime literature. Sailors who had survived such events described the overwhelming sense of helplessness that came with watching a wall of churning water bearing down on their ship. The sound alone, a roaring that combined the worst aspects of wind and waterfall, could drive rational men to panic, causing them to abandon vessels that might actually have survived the encounter intact. What made waterspouts particularly relevant to the Mary Celeste mystery was their unpredictable behavior. These phenomena could dissipate as quickly as they formed, leaving behind calm seas and clear skies that showed no evidence of the terror that had just passed. A ship abandoned in the face of an approaching waterspout might be found hours later, sailing peacefully through waters that bore no trace of the disturbance that had caused her crew to flee. Seaquakes offered another natural explanation that maritime experts considered seriously. These underwater earthquakes could create conditions on the surface that seemed to threaten a ship's integrity, generating unusual wave patterns, strange sounds from the ocean depths, and vibrations that might convince a captain that his vessel was breaking apart. The Mediterranean region was particularly prone to seismic activity, and tremors originating near the seafloor could propagate across hundreds of miles of ocean. Sailors who had experienced seaquakes described sensations that could easily be mistaken for catastrophic hull damage, grinding sounds that seemed to come from the ship's structure, vibrations that made the deck feel unstable underfoot, and wave patterns that defied normal understanding of ocean behavior. A captain faced with such phenomena, particularly one sailing with his wife and young daughter aboard, might reasonably conclude that immediate evacuation was the only prudent course of action. The cargo itself suggested another natural explanation that investigators found increasingly plausible as they learned more about the properties of industrial alcohol. The 1,700 barrels contained methanol and other chemicals that could produce toxic fumes under certain conditions, particularly if the contents were subjected to temperature changes or agitation during rough weather. Carbon monoxide poisoning from cargo fumes had claimed the lives of sailors on other vessels, and the symptoms, confusion, disorientation, and impaired judgment, could lead to irrational decisions that seemed incomprehensible to later investigators. If dangerous gases had begun accumulating in the Mary Celeste's hold, Captain Briggs might have ordered the forward hatch opened for ventilation, while simultaneously preparing to abandon ship if the situation worsened. The theory gained credibility when experts noted that alcohol fumes, being heavier than air, would tend to settle in the lower parts of the ship where they might not be immediately detected. By the time dangerous concentrations built up in the living quarters, the crew might have had only minutes to escape before becoming incapacitated. The missing chronometer could be explained as an essential navigation tool that Captain Briggs had grabbed while preparing for what he hoped would be a temporary evacuation. Shifting cargo presented yet another possibility that maritime insurance companies had encountered on numerous occasions. If the alcohol barrels had not been properly secured, rough weather could cause them to move within the hold, creating both immediate physical danger and the potential for catastrophic hull damage. The sound of heavy barrels breaking loose and rolling around in the cargo space would be terrifying to anyone aboard, particularly in rough seas, where the ship's motion would amplify every impact. Experienced sailors knew that shifting cargo could transform a seaworthy vessel into a death trap within minutes. The Mary Celeste's relatively small crew might not have been able to secure the barrels once they began moving, leaving Captain Briggs with the choice between risking his family's lives in an attempt to save the ship or abandoning her before the situation became completely uncontrollable. Storm damage to the ship's navigation instruments offered another natural explanation for the abandonment. The destroyed compass binnacle found by the boarding party suggested that severe weather had struck the Mary Celeste at some point during her voyage. Without reliable navigation equipment, particularly in the busy shipping lanes of the North Atlantic, continuing the voyage would have been extremely hazardous. A captain faced with damaged navigational instruments might reasonably decide that the safest course was to abandon his ship and hope for rescue by a passing vessel, rather than risk collision or running aground while sailing effectively blind. The fact that the Mary Celeste was found relatively close to established shipping routes supported this theory, suggesting that Captain Briggs might have been attempting to position his ship where other vessels were likely to discover her. Rogue waves, those massive walls of water that could appear without warning even in moderate sea conditions, represented another natural force capable of causing sudden panic aboard a merchant vessel. These waves, sometimes reaching heights of 60 feet or more, could strike with such violence that even experienced sailors might conclude their ship was doomed, particularly if the initial impact caused visible damage or flooding. The psychological impact of a rogue wave encounter was documented in numerous maritime accounts. Captains who had survived such events described the overwhelming sense of vulnerability that came with watching a mountain of water crash over their vessel, the certainty that no ship could withstand such punishment, and the desperate scramble to preserve human life when it seemed that the vessel itself was lost. Yet for all their plausibility, these natural explanations faced the same fundamental problem that had puzzled the Gibraltar inquiry. If the Mary Celeste had been abandoned due to temporary danger from weather, seaquakes, or cargo problems, why hadn't Captain Briggs and his companions returned to reclaim their ship once the immediate threat had passed? The vessel had been drifting for days or possibly weeks before her discovery, time enough for any natural phenomenon to run its course and conditions to return to normal. The ocean, it seemed, was capable of creating mysteries as vast and deep as the waters themselves, phenomena that could drive rational people to seemingly irrational actions, leaving behind questions that defied easy answers even when the physical evidence was carefully preserved and methodically analyzed. Chapter 11. Theories: Human Fear and Error. While natural forces offered compelling explanations for the Mary Celeste's abandonment, maritime investigators increasingly turned their attention to the human element of the mystery. Sailors, no matter how experienced, remained susceptible to fear, miscalculation, and the kind of errors in judgment that could transform routine situations into perceived emergencies requiring immediate action. The psychology of decision-making at sea was fundamentally different from that on land, where help was typically available and mistakes could often be corrected. On the open ocean, with no rescue services within hundreds of miles and weather conditions subject to rapid change, even minor problems could escalate in the minds of those responsible for the safety of ship and crew. Captain Briggs, sailing with his wife and infant daughter, would have been particularly sensitive to any situation that seemed to threaten their welfare. The alcohol cargo that filled the Mary Celeste's hold presented numerous opportunities for human error and misjudgment. Industrial alcohol produced fumes that, while not immediately toxic in small quantities, could accumulate in enclosed spaces to create both health hazards and explosion risks. A captain discovering unusual odors emanating from his cargo hold, particularly one who understood the volatile nature of his freight, might reasonably conclude that immediate evacuation was the only prudent response. What made this theory particularly compelling was the evidence found aboard the abandoned ship. The forward hatch had been removed and was lying on the deck, suggesting that someone had opened it to ventilate the cargo area. This action was consistent with attempts to clear dangerous fumes from the hold. But it also indicated that the perceived threat had been serious enough to warrant immediate attention, rather than waiting for more convenient circumstances. The timing of such a discovery would have been crucial to Captain Briggs's decision-making process. If dangerous fumes had been detected during rough weather, when launching the ship's boat would itself be hazardous, the captain might have felt trapped between immediate danger from the cargo and significant risk from abandoning ship. Under such pressure, Even experienced mariners could make choices that seemed irrational to later investigators examining the situation under calm conditions. Navigation errors offered another human explanation for the abandonment that maritime experts found plausible. The Mary Celeste's chronometer was missing when the ship was discovered, and this essential instrument was crucial for determining longitude with any degree of accuracy. If the chronometer had been damaged by rough weather or mechanical failure, Captain Briggs would have faced the prospect of navigating by dead reckoning alone across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The psychological pressure of navigation uncertainty, particularly for a captain responsible for his family's safety, could have influenced decisions in ways that were difficult for landlubbers to understand. Without accurate position-fixing capability, the Mary Celeste might have been dangerously close to shipping lanes, where collision was a constant threat, or approaching hazardous waters where rocks and shoals could destroy the ship without warning. A captain who believed his ship was lost, either due to navigation problems or other perceived emergencies, might have decided that the safest course was to abandon the vessel and hope for rescue by a passing ship. The lifeboat's removal appeared to have been deliberate rather than the result of storm damage, supporting theories that suggested planned evacuation rather than panic-driven flight. The missing chronometer could also be explained as an essential tool that Captain Briggs had taken with him when abandoning ship, either because he hoped to return and reclaim the Mary Celeste once immediate dangers had passed, or because accurate timekeeping would be crucial for navigation if the lifeboat's occupants hoped to reach land or encounter rescue vessels. Faulty sounding equipment presented another possibility for human error that could have tragic consequences. If the ship's depth measuring instruments had given incorrect readings, Captain Briggs seemed to believe the Mary Celeste was taking on water at a rate that would eventually sink her. The 3.5 feet of water found in the ship's bilge was more than normal, but far from dangerous for a vessel of her size and construction. However, if the pumping equipment had been damaged or if the crew had been unable to determine the source of the water, a prudent captain might have concluded that evacuation was necessary before the situation deteriorated further. The fact that the pumps were found in working condition suggested that the water intrusion had not been serious enough to warrant abandonment, but Captain Briggs would have had to make his decision based on conditions as they appeared at the time. Communication failures between officers and crew could also have contributed to decisions that seemed inexplicable to later investigators. If different members of the ship's company had observed various problems, cargo fumes, navigation difficulties, water intrusion, or equipment failures, without coordinating their observations, the cumulative effect might have created an impression of multiple emergencies requiring immediate action. The human tendency to overestimate danger when multiple problems appeared simultaneously was well documented in maritime psychology. Individual challenges that could be managed separately might seem overwhelming when encountered together, particularly for a captain who felt responsible not only for his crew, but for his wife and child. Weather prediction errors represented another area where human judgment could lead to tragic miscalculations. The meteorological instruments available in 1872 were primitive by modern standards, and weather forecasting was more art than science. Captain Briggs might have interpreted atmospheric signs as indicating an approaching storm severe enough to threaten his ship's survival, prompting evacuation before conditions made launching the lifeboat impossible. The fact that the Mary Celeste was found sailing in relatively calm conditions suggested that any severe weather had either passed quickly or had been less dangerous than originally feared. But weather patterns in the North Atlantic could change rapidly, and a captain who believed his ship faced imminent destruction from storm conditions would have had little time for careful analysis before making the decision to abandon her. Crew panic, while inconsistent with the generally excellent reputations of the men who had sailed aboard the Mary Celeste, remained a possibility that investigators could not entirely dismiss. Even experienced sailors could be affected by fear when faced with unfamiliar circumstances, particularly if they believed their ship was in immediate danger from fire, explosion, or sinking. The domino effect of panic could explain how relatively minor problems escalated into perceived emergencies requiring immediate evacuation. If one or two crew members had reacted with visible fear to cargo fumes, navigation problems, or other difficulties, their anxiety might have influenced others until the entire ship's company became convinced that abandonment was their only chance for survival. Yet all of these human explanations face the same fundamental puzzle that had confounded the Gibraltar inquiry and continued to baffle maritime experts decades later. If the Mary Celeste had been abandoned due to human error, miscalculation, or temporary panic, why hadn't Captain Briggs and his companions returned to reclaim their ship once they realized their mistake? The answer to that question lay hidden somewhere in the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, along with the final fate of 10 souls who had trusted their lives to a small boat on waters that showed mercy to no one, no matter how skilled or experienced they might be. Chapter 12. Theories. Beyond reason. As the years passed and rational explanations for the Mary Celeste's abandonment proved insufficient to solve the mystery completely, the human imagination began to explore territories that lay beyond the boundaries of conventional maritime investigation. The ocean, after all, had always been humanity's greatest source of supernatural folklore, a realm where the impossible seemed merely improbable, and where even the most skeptical sailors occasionally witnessed phenomena that defied scientific explanation. The Mary Celeste story possessed all the elements necessary to capture the supernatural imagination. Here was a ship found sailing herself across empty seas, her crew vanished without trace, her cargo intact, and her structure unmarked by violence or obvious catastrophe. The very completeness of the disappearance suggested forces beyond human understanding, phenomena that operated according to laws unknown to maritime science or legal investigation. Sailors had whispered of ghost ships for as long as humans had ventured beyond sight of land, vessels cursed by tragedy or supernatural intervention to sail the oceans eternally without rest. The Mary Celeste's earlier history as the unlucky Amazon, with her succession of accidents, deaths, and misfortunes, provided fertile ground for those who believed that some ships attracted malevolent forces that no amount of paint, prayer, or renaming could entirely dispel. The supernatural explanation gained credibility from the maritime community's long tradition of recognizing forces that lay beyond scientific analysis. Experienced captains who scoffed at landsmen's tales of ghosts and spirits, nonetheless, maintained careful watch for phenomena that they couldn't explain, but had learned to respect. The sea, they knew, operated according to patterns that human knowledge had not yet fully comprehended. Ghost ship legends typically involved vessels whose crews had perished under circumstances so tragic or unjust that their spirits could not find rest. The Mary Celeste's case was unusual because her crew had apparently vanished rather than died aboard the ship. But supernatural theorists suggested that this very absence of bodies indicated intervention by forces that existed outside normal physical reality. Some investigators proposed that the Mary Celeste had encountered supernatural entities that had somehow transported her human cargo to realms beyond earthly existence. This theory, while impossible to prove or disprove, offered an explanation for the complete absence of any trace of the missing people. Unlike theories involving lifeboat disasters or drowning, supernatural intervention could account for the total disappearance of bodies, personal effects, and any evidence of struggle or distress. The timing of the disappearance also attracted supernatural interpretation. December was traditionally considered a month when the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds became permeable, when strange phenomena were more likely to manifest themselves in the physical realm. The Mary Celeste's abandonment during this period seemed to some observers more than mere coincidence. Maritime folklore included numerous accounts of ships that had encountered zones of supernatural activity, areas of ocean where the normal laws of physics and reality operated differently. These regions, sometimes called Devil's Triangles, long before that term became associated with specific geographical locations, were said to exist throughout the world's oceans, invisible to normal navigation, but capable of affecting any vessel unlucky enough to enter their influence. Theorists who subscribed to supernatural explanations suggested that the Mary Celeste had sailed into one of these zones, where her crew had been subjected to forces or entities that existed beyond human comprehension. The ship herself, being an inanimate object, had been left to continue her voyage while her human cargo was removed to destinations that no earthly investigation could ever reach. The complete absence of any supernatural evidence aboard the Mary Celeste posed challenges for these theories. But believers argued that truly powerful supernatural forces would leave no traces that human investigators could detect. The very normalcy of the scene found by the boarding party from the Dei Gratia could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural intervention so complete that it transcended physical reality entirely. Religious interpretations of the mystery drew upon maritime Christianity's long tradition of recognizing divine intervention in human affairs at sea. Some theorists suggested that the Mary Celeste's crew had been called to a higher purpose, taken from their earthly voyage to serve divine will in ways that mortal understanding could not comprehend. This explanation appealed particularly to those who knew Captain Briggs's reputation for deep religious faith and moral character. The biblical precedent of people being translated to heaven without experiencing death provided theological support for theories that the Mary Celeste's passengers and crew had been chosen for divine purposes that required their removal from the physical world. The peaceful condition in which the ship was found, with no signs of struggle or distress, seemed consistent with divine intervention rather than earthly catastrophe. Occult explanations drew upon traditions of magic and mysticism that had existed alongside maritime culture for centuries. Some investigators proposed that the Mary Celeste had encountered practitioners of supernatural arts who possessed the power to transport human beings across dimensional boundaries or into alternate realms of existence. These theories, while lacking physical evidence, offered explanations for phenomena that conventional investigation had failed to resolve. The alcohol cargo that filled the Mary Celeste's hold attracted particular attention from occult theorists, who noted that alcohol had been used in magical practices throughout human history. Some suggested that the industrial alcohol aboard the ship might have been intended for purposes beyond commercial use, perhaps serving as a medium for supernatural activities that had resulted in the crew's disappearance. Time displacement theories, drawing upon emerging scientific concepts about the nature of time and space, proposed that the Mary Celeste had encountered a temporal anomaly that had transported her crew to different periods in history. This explanation could account for their complete disappearance while leaving the ship herself to continue sailing in normal time, eventually to be discovered by the Dei Gratia. Extraterrestrial theories, while anachronistic for the 1870s, would later be applied retroactively to the Mary Celeste mystery as human understanding of the universe expanded. These explanations suggested that beings from other worlds had removed the ship's human cargo for purposes related to scientific study or other activities beyond earthly comprehension. Yet for all their imaginative appeal, supernatural theories faced the same evidentiary challenges that had frustrated more conventional investigations. The Mary Celeste had been thoroughly examined by experienced maritime professionals who found no trace of supernatural intervention, no physical evidence of forces beyond natural understanding, and no clues that pointed toward explanations outside the realm of known phenomena. The enduring appeal of supernatural theories lay not in their ability to provide verifiable answers, but in their capacity to offer explanations for a mystery that seemed to transcend the boundaries of rational investigation. In a case where conventional analysis had failed to provide satisfactory solutions, the human imagination naturally turned toward possibilities that lay beyond the limits of scientific understanding. The Mary Celeste had become more than just an abandoned ship. She'd evolved into a symbol of the ocean's capacity to preserve mysteries that challenged human comprehension. A reminder that, despite all our advances in maritime science and investigation, the sea still held secrets that might never yield to rational explanation. Chapter 13. The Ship's Afterlife. The Mary Celeste returned to her owners after the Gibraltar inquiry, like a specter returning to haunt the living. The ship that had once been simply another working vessel in the merchant marine was now infamous, her name whispered in harbors and shipping offices with the kind of superstitious reverence usually reserved for tales of supernatural encounters. For a vessel whose livelihood depended on finding crews willing to sail her and cargoes willing to trust their fortunes to her hold, such notoriety was as dangerous as any storm. James Winchester and his fellow owners faced the immediate practical challenge of returning their vessel to profitable service. The Mary Celeste was structurally sound, her machinery functional, and her cargo capacity unchanged by the mysterious events that had made her famous. But maritime commerce operated as much on reputation and sailor confidence as it did on technical specifications, and the Mary Celeste's reputation had been irreparably damaged by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Finding a captain willing to command the Mary Celeste proved more difficult than her owners had anticipated. Word of the mysterious abandonment had spread throughout the maritime community with the speed that only truly extraordinary stories could achieve. Experienced captains who might ordinarily have competed for command of a well-found vessel found themselves reluctant to associate their careers with a ship that sailors increasingly regarded as cursed or unlucky. The superstitions that governed maritime culture in the 19th century were not mere folklore but practical considerations that affected every aspect of shipboard life. Sailors who believed their vessel was cursed would work with less efficiency, show greater tendency toward panic in dangerous situations, and might even jump ship in foreign ports rather than complete voyages aboard an unlucky vessel. No captain wanted to command a crew whose confidence in their ship had been undermined before they ever left port. When the Mary Celeste finally found a new captain willing to take command, it was George Blatchford, a man whose practical nature apparently overcame whatever superstitions he might have harbored about the vessel's reputation. Blatchford's first voyage in command proceeded without incident, carrying cargo across familiar Atlantic routes and proving that the ship herself remained as seaworthy as ever, whatever supernatural forces might or might not have influenced her previous mysterious abandonment. But even successful voyages could not entirely dispel the atmosphere of unease that seemed to follow the Mary Celeste wherever she sailed. Port officials who boarded her for routine inspections found themselves looking for signs of the supernatural, examining her holds and quarters with the kind of nervous attention usually reserved for vessels suspected of smuggling contraband. Dock workers and stevedores approached her with visible reluctance, completing their tasks with unusual haste as if eager to minimize their contact with a ship that had acquired such an ominous reputation. The Mary Celeste's cargo manifests during this period reflected the difficulty her owners faced in securing profitable freight. Where once she might have carried valuable goods for established merchants, she increasingly found herself transporting less prestigious cargoes at reduced rates, her owners accepting whatever business they could secure for a vessel that many shippers preferred to avoid. Over the following years, the Mary Celeste changed hands several times as her original owners sought to distance themselves from the continued financial burden of operating a ship that had become more famous for mystery than for reliable service. Each new owner hoped that time would fade the memories that made the vessel difficult to operate profitably, but the story of her mysterious abandonment had become so deeply embedded in maritime folklore that no amount of routine service could entirely erase its influence. The ship's final chapter began in 1884 when she fell under the ownership of a group that included Gilman C. Parker, a man whose approach to maritime commerce was considerably less scrupulous than that of her previous owners. Parker saw in the Mary Celeste's notorious reputation an opportunity rather than a liability, a chance to stage an insurance fraud that would finally extract profit from a vessel that had become increasingly difficult to operate legitimately. Parker loaded the Mary Celeste with a cargo of boots, cat food, and other goods of questionable value, then deliberately sailed her onto the coral reefs near Haiti in January 1885. The plan was simple: claim that the ship had been lost due to navigational error, collect the insurance money, and finally put an end to the financial drain that the Mary Celeste had become for everyone who owned her. But the Mary Celeste's reputation for mystery and misfortune extended even to this final criminal act. The insurance fraud was so clumsily executed that investigators quickly uncovered evidence of deliberate wrecking. Parker found himself facing criminal charges, his co-conspirators fled or turned state's evidence, and the scandal that surrounded the ship's final destruction became almost as notorious as the original mystery of her abandoned voyage. The legal proceedings that followed Parker's arrest revealed a web of financial desperation and criminal conspiracy that had grown around the Mary Celeste like barnacles on a ship's hull. The vessel that had once carried legitimate cargo for honest merchants had become a tool for insurance fraud, her final service to commerce involving deception and theft rather than the honorable transportation of goods across the world's oceans. Gilman Parker died in poverty and disgrace before his case could be fully resolved by the courts. Some said driven to his grave by the guilt and shame of his association with the Mary Celeste's dishonorable end. The ship herself lay broken on the coral reefs where Parker had destroyed her, her timbers gradually scattered by Caribbean storms, and her metal fittings claimed by salvagers who cared nothing for her infamous history. The physical destruction of the Mary Celeste in 1885 marked the end of her career as a working vessel, but in many ways it was only the beginning of her true immortality. Free from the constraints of mundane maritime service, she could now exist purely as legend, her story growing and evolving with each retelling until the facts of her final years were overshadowed by the enduring mystery of that December morning when she was found sailing empty through the Atlantic swells. The irony of her end was not lost on those who had followed her story from the beginning. A ship that had become famous for mystery and supernatural associations had met her end through the most prosaic of human failings: greed, fraud, and criminal stupidity. Yet, even this ignominious conclusion seemed somehow fitting for a vessel that had spent her entire career attracting misfortune and confounding the expectations of everyone who encountered her. The Mary Celeste had finally found the rest that had eluded her throughout her troubled existence. Her broken timbers settling into the coral sands where Caribbean currents would gradually disperse them across the ocean floor. But her story, freed from the limitations of physical reality, was just beginning its journey into the realm of legend where mysteries could exist forever, unsolved and endlessly fascinating to human imagination. Chapter 14. A Legend is Born. Even as the physical Mary Celeste lay broken on the coral reefs near Haiti, her story was beginning a different kind of voyage, one that would carry her far beyond the boundaries of maritime history into the broader realm of human imagination. The mystery that had confounded the Gibraltar Inquiry and puzzled maritime experts for more than a decade was about to become something larger and more enduring than any single ship or historical event. The transformation began in the pages of newspapers and maritime journals, where the Mary Celeste's story was told and retold with embellishments that grew more dramatic with each iteration. Writers who had never set foot aboard a ship found themselves drawn to a mystery that seemed to embody every supernatural fear and romantic notion that landlubbers associated with life at sea. The abandoned vessel sailing herself across empty waters became a perfect canvas for authors seeking to explore themes of isolation, mystery, and the unknown. It was Arthur Conan Doyle, then a young and relatively unknown writer, who would prove most instrumental in transforming the Mary Celeste from historical curiosity into cultural phenomenon. In 1884, just as the real ship was meeting her inglorious end in Caribbean waters, Doyle published a short story titled J, Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, in Cornhill magazine, a fictional account that would forever change how the world remembered the Mary Celeste. Doyle's story took considerable liberties with the known facts, renaming the ship Mary Celeste and creating a narrative involving racial conspiracy, murder, and revenge that bore little resemblance to the prosaic theories that maritime investigators had developed. But fiction succeeded where fact had failed, providing readers with a complete narrative that explained every mystery and resolved every question, even if that resolution existed only in the realm of imagination. The story's impact was immediate and profound. Readers who had followed the real Mary Celeste case in newspaper accounts found Doyle's fictional explanation so compelling that many began to believe it was based on suppressed evidence or insider knowledge. The line between historical fact and literary invention became blurred in the public mind, with Doyle's dramatic story often being remembered more vividly than the actual testimony given at Gibraltar. Doyle himself would later express some regret about the story's influence, recognizing that his fictional account had overwhelmed the historical record in popular memory. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. The Mary Celeste had become not just a historical mystery, but a literary archetype, the perfect ghost ship that would inspire countless imitations and variations in years to come. The story's popularity coincided with a broader cultural fascination with maritime mysteries and supernatural phenomena that characterized the late 19th century. Ghost stories were enjoying unprecedented popularity. Scientific investigation of psychic phenomena was gaining respectability, and the general public possessed an appetite for mysteries that seemed to suggest the existence of forces beyond conventional understanding. The Mary Celeste fit perfectly into this cultural moment, offering a mystery that was simultaneously historical and supernatural, factual and fantastic. Unlike purely fictional ghost stories, the Mary Celeste had the advantage of being rooted in documented events that could be verified through official records and witness testimony. This foundation of fact gave the mystery a credibility that purely imaginary tales could never achieve. Maritime museums and historical societies found themselves fielding increasing numbers of inquiries about the Mary Celeste as public interest in the story grew. Exhibits featuring models of the ship and displays of evidence from the Gibraltar inquiry became popular attractions, drawing visitors who wanted to see physical artifacts connected to the famous mystery. The ship had become a tourist attraction decades after her destruction. The influence of the Mary Celeste story extended far beyond maritime history into broader areas of popular culture. Writers of mystery and supernatural fiction began using abandoned ships as plot devices, creating variations on the theme that Doyle had established. The concept of the ghost ship, while ancient in maritime folklore, gained new prominence and specificity through association with the Mary Celeste's well-documented case. Theater productions began incorporating Mary Celeste themes into their dramatizations of maritime adventure and supernatural mystery. Audiences who might never venture onto the ocean themselves found vicarious thrills in stories of ships sailing empty through fog-shrouded waters. Their crews vanished without explanation, and their destinations unknown. The story's appeal transcended national boundaries as translations of Doyle's fictional account and various newspaper treatments of the actual case spread the Mary Celeste legend throughout Europe and beyond. Each culture that encountered the story adapted it to fit local maritime traditions and supernatural beliefs, creating variations that preserved the essential mystery while reflecting regional differences in storytelling and folklore. Scientific investigators who had hoped that advancing maritime technology and improved communication systems would eventually solve the Mary Celeste mystery found instead that public interest in supernatural explanations continued to grow. The more rational the proposed solutions became, the more attractive the irrational alternatives appeared to popular imagination. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Mary Celeste had achieved a kind of cultural immortality that no amount of factual investigation could diminish. She had become more than a historical event. She was now a symbol, a representation of the ocean's capacity to preserve mysteries that challenged human understanding. Her story had evolved beyond the constraints of historical accuracy into something that could adapt to changing times and cultures while preserving its essential power to fascinate and perplex. The transformation was complete. The Mary Celeste had begun her existence as a working merchant vessel, built to carry cargo across predictable routes between familiar ports. She would be remembered forever as something far more mysterious and significant. The archetype of the ghost ship, sailing eternally through human imagination on voyages that would never reach any earthly destination. Future generations would encounter her story in books and films, in maritime museums and supernatural investigations, in scholarly articles and sensational tabloid accounts. Each telling would add new details or interpretations, but the essential mystery would remain unchanged. Somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean in December 1872, 10 people had vanished from a seaworthy ship, leaving behind questions that no amount of investigation had been able to answer definitively. The Mary Celeste had achieved the kind of immortality that few ships and fewer mysteries ever attain. She would sail on forever through the realm of human imagination, her empty deck and silent rigging carrying mysteries that would outlive every theory proposed to explain them. Epilogue: the sea's secret. And so we return to where we began, to that endless horizon where sky meets water in a line so perfect it seems drawn by divine hand. The stars above shine with the same steady light that guided mariners in 1872, their ancient patterns unchanged by all the theories and investigations that have surrounded the Mary Celeste mystery for more than a century and a half. The ocean rolls in the same gentle rhythm, keeping its secrets with the patient silence of eternity. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, perhaps you find yourself wondering about the nature of mystery itself. Why do certain unexplained events capture our imagination so completely while others fade into historical footnotes? What is it about the Mary Celeste that continues to fascinate us when so many other maritime disasters have been forgotten by all but the most dedicated scholars? The answer, perhaps, lies in the very completeness of the mystery. The Mary Celeste offers us a puzzle with all the pieces present, but none of them fitting together in a way that satisfies our need for closure. We have the ship, the cargo, the personal belongings, the weather records, the witness testimony, and the detailed investigations. Yet despite this wealth of evidence, the central question remains as unanswered as it was on that December morning when Captain Morehouse first spotted her sailing alone through the Atlantic swells. There is something profoundly human in our need to solve puzzles, to impose order on chaos, to find explanations that make sense of events that seem to defy understanding. We are creatures who tell ourselves stories to make meaning from the random events that surround us. And the Mary Celeste presents us with a story that refuses to be completed in any satisfactory way. Perhaps that is the true lesson of the Mary Celeste, that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, that some questions are more valuable than their answers. In our age of instant information and scientific explanation, there is something almost refreshing about encountering a puzzle that has resisted solution for more than 150 years. A reminder that the world still holds secrets that lie beyond our ability to comprehend. The ocean itself seems to understand this truth. It has swallowed countless ships over the millennia, claimed the lives of millions of sailors, and witnessed events that no human eye will ever see. Most of these stories are lost forever, their details scattered like foam on the wind. But occasionally, very rarely, the sea chooses to preserve a mystery in such perfect detail that it becomes immortal, a puzzle that will outlive every attempt to solve it. The Mary Celeste has become one of these chosen mysteries, elevated from historical curiosity to something approaching myth. She represents our relationship with the unknown, our fascination with questions that have no definitive answers, our willingness to keep searching for truth, even when that truth seems destined to remain forever beyond our reach. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is still and the boundaries between waking and sleeping become permeable, you might find yourself imagining that ghostly brigantine still sailing somewhere beyond the horizon, her sails full of wind that comes from no earthly source, her deck empty but somehow expectant, her course set for destinations that exist only in the realm of dreams and speculation. Captain Benjamin Briggs stands at her helm, his weathered hands steady on the wheel, his eyes scanning waters that stretch beyond the limits of any chart. Sarah tends her herb garden in pots that never empty, while little Sophia plays games that have no ending with toys that never break or lose their wonder. The crew goes about their duties with the unhurried competence of men who have all the time in the world to complete their tasks. They are sailing still, these 10 souls who vanished so completely that their fate became the ocean's greatest mystery. Their voyage continues in the stories we tell ourselves about unexplained disappearances and supernatural interventions. They have found a kind of immortality that few mortals achieve, living on in the questions they left behind and the theories that attempt to explain their disappearance. The Mary Celeste reminds us that mystery itself is a precious thing in our world of increasingly complete knowledge and technological explanation. There is value in maintaining spaces for wonder, in preserving questions that resist easy answers, in accepting that some secrets are meant to remain secret. As you settle into the peaceful rhythms of approaching sleep, let yourself drift alongside that phantom ship through waters that exist somewhere between memory and imagination. Feel the gentle motion of deck beneath your feet. Hear the soft whisper of wind through rigging. Smell the salt air that connects all ocean voyages across time and space. The Mary Celeste sails on through the quiet hours of the night, carrying her mysteries like precious cargo that can never be delivered but will never be abandoned. She has found her true destination at last, not in any earthly port, but in the endless ocean of human curiosity, where questions matter more than answers, and wonder is more valuable than certainty. The sea keeps its secrets, as it always has and always will. But sometimes, on nights when the stars shine particularly bright and the boundary between known and unknown grows thin, those secrets seem almost close enough to touch, almost ready to whisper their truths to anyone patient enough to listen for voices that speak in the language of wind and wave. The Mary Celeste still drifts, not on the waves, but through our dreams, carrying her eternal passengers toward mysteries that will outlive every attempt to solve them, sailing forever through the vast and patient ocean of human imagination. Sleep well and dream of horizons that stretch beyond the edge of all our charts, where mysteries wait like distant islands and seas we have yet to explore.